At 6:03 p.m., federal officials stood behind podiums and described what they called a routine compliance inspection, quoting state licensing records that showed hundreds of enrolled children and fully compliant attendance documentation, while another statement insisted that public funds were used exactly as intended. But those assurances collapsed under the weight of numbers that could not be ignored. $2.8 billion in taxpayer funds dispersed over 4 years, less than 4% spent on legitimate care, more than 800 children listed on paper but functionally unaccounted for, and a single location receiving $46 million in 1 year alone, figures that dwarfed typical child care subsidies by more than 480% above baseline. At 4:52 a.m. in southern St. Paul, federal agents from the FBI and the Department of Health and Human Services arrived at a state-licensed child care center expecting clipboards and checklists, not silence. And what they found immediately unsettled them, because on paper this was a respectable operation, a licensed facility, an experienced director, a network serving working families. But inside the building, the reality was far darker, with empty rooms, untouched toys, cribs that had never been slept in, and attendance sheets filled with meticulous consistency that suggested care had been provided every day without interruption. Something was deeply wrong, and investigators knew it within minutes, because legitimacy here was not merely thin, it was performative, designed to satisfy databases rather than children. And as agents moved room to room, they began to understand that this was not a clerical discrepancy or an isolated lapse, but a contradiction embedded into the structure itself, where forms validated each other and numbers confirmed themselves without ever encountering reality. At 5:11 a.m., inside a private office, auditors documented rosters listing hundreds of children tied to synthetic identities and stolen Social Security numbers, an administrative fiction that unlocked millions in monthly payments while no child ever crossed the threshold. And this was the first indication that the operation extended far beyond a single address. Investigators would later determine that the network had operated openly for years, protected not by secrecy, but by normalcy, because everything looked correct to systems designed to check paperwork rather than presence. And the scale of the loss, billions intended for child care and food assistance, meant the victims were not abstract, but families who never received services, communities hollowed out by diverted resources, and oversight bodies that mistook repetition for verification. Officials would eventually acknowledge that this case did not begin with a raid or a tip, but with an assumption that licensed meant legitimate, and that assumption allowed money to move uninterrupted through intermediary accounts and overseas wires kept just below reporting thresholds, while the public face of the operation remained calm and compliant. What they found would expose how an institution built to protect children became a conduit for systemic theft, how trust replaced scrutiny, and how a system that appeared functional on every screen failed at its most basic task. And if you are curious about how this contradiction was engineered and sustained, comment "truth" to follow what investigators uncovered next. Behind closed doors, investigators uncovered that the unexpected authority figure anchoring the operation was not a shadowy financier or an anonymous shell executive, but a licensed child care director trusted by regulators and parents alike, a woman whose credentials included more than a decade in early childhood administration, multiple state approvals, clean inspection histories, and a reputation within her community as a reliable provider of essential services. For years, her facilities passed audits because on paper they were exemplary, with enrollment numbers rising steadily, attendance logs completed daily, and compliance forms submitted on time. And this surface legitimacy created a protective halo that discouraged deeper scrutiny. But when federal analysts reconstructed the flow of money, they found that behind this facade was a deliberately engineered system designed to convert social trust into cash at industrial scale. The operation functioned through a layered architecture in which synthetic child identities were generated, matched to stolen Social Security numbers, and rotated across multiple locations to avoid duplication flags, while subsidy requests were staggered so that no single transaction exceeded reporting thresholds, allowing funds to clear automatically through state and federal systems. This was not a matter of falsifying one ledger or inflating a single claim. This was worse, a coordinated financial machine that operated for nearly 4 consecutive years without without interruption, during which approximately $2.8 billion moved through dozens of intermediary accounts, an amount nearly matching the annual budget of some small U.S. cities. And investigators noted that less than 4 cents of every dollar went toward rent, utilities, or minimal staffing to preserve appearances. Protection came not from intimidation or bribery, but from bureaucracy itself, because licensing databases validated attendance databases, which in turn validated payment systems, creating a closed loop where oversight became procedural and verification became optional. This was not isolated misconduct. It was systematic, with multiple facilities operating in parallel, sharing templates, schedules, and accounting software, effectively franchising fraud under the cover of childcare services. Midway through the inquiry, agents identified a physical infrastructure that tied the financial crime to something even more consequential: an industrial property listed as abandoned on municipal records located outside Minneapolis, measuring approximately 312 feet long, about 100 meters, and subdivided into concealed workspaces that drew power and water through rerouted municipal lines, a site funded entirely by diverted subsidies. Behind its locked doors, investigators would later document equipment and materials inconsistent with any child-care-related purpose, evidence that the stolen funds were being repurposed to sustain a secondary operation with its own logistics and personnel. And this discovery reframed the case from fraud to a broader criminal enterprise embedded within legitimate social services. This was not misuse of aid, it was exploitation of trust at scale. And as one senior analyst noted internally, the system survived because it looked normal, because it wore the language and paperwork of care. And if you want to support authorities trying to dismantle structures like this, comment "expose it" as the investigation widened. At 4:52 a.m., federal teams moved simultaneously across the Twin Cities, coordinating a pre-dawn operation involving the FBI, the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Inspector General, Homeland Security Investigations, and state-level financial crimes units, an escalation triggered by what analysts now believed was a dual-use criminal enterprise. By 5:06 a.m., the first doors were breached at multiple child care facilities, silence ending as agents advanced through hallways already familiar from inspections. But this time the purpose was different because compliance had given way to seizure, and inside the first location they secured offices containing servers, hard drives, and filing cabinets packed with attendance sheets dating back years, each one fully completed, each one representing children who never existed. By 5:18 a.m., at a separate address, agents encountered their first resistance when 2 individuals attempted to flee through a rear exit. Pursuit that lasted 43 seconds before both were detained without gunfire, underscoring that the protection of this network had never depended on force but on invisibility. At 5:31 a.m., attention shifted to the industrial property listed as abandoned, where tactical teams breached reinforced doors and advanced into a cavernous interior, their body cameras capturing rows of industrial equipment, chemical containers, and makeshift sleeping quarters. And inside were 27 prepared containers of narcotics precursor materials weighing a combined 1.3 tons, evidence that the stolen subsidies had been converted into physical inventory. Nearby, agents discovered locked interior rooms, and at 5:47 a.m., those doors were forced open to reveal dozens of people inside, some malnourished, some disoriented, several later confirmed to have been reported missing for months, their presence transforming the operation from financial fraud into a humanitarian emergency. Medical teams were called. Immediately, and by 6:12 a.m., victims were being triaged while agents continued to secure the site, documenting cash bundles totaling approximately $45 million stacked in sealed bins, alongside ledgers that tracked overseas wire transfers kept deliberately below federal reporting thresholds. By 6:34 a.m., the facility was fully secured, power shut down, and evidence teams began cataloging what would become one of the largest seizures in state history, while parallel teams across Minneapolis reported similar discoveries, including shell offices with no staff, empty classrooms maintained solely for inspections, and computers programmed to auto-generate enrollment data. At 7:08 a.m., authorities confirmed that more than a dozen affiliated offices had been searched, assets frozen, and over 90 individuals identified for charging consideration, a scope that made clear this was not a localized scam, but an integrated system designed to exploit public trust end to end. Stay with this. Video, if you support agents risking their lives to dismantle operations that hide behind legitimacy, because what unfolded that morning marked only the visible collapse of a structure that had been operating undetected for years. Financial forensics teams moved in after the arrests, tracing approximately $2.8 billion through more than 40 shell companies and intermediary accounts that spanned state lines and crossed borders. A paper trail reconstructed transaction by transaction to reveal how funds meant for childcare and food assistance were converted into capital for unrelated criminal activity over a 4-year timeline, and what emerged was not a failure of accounting software or a loophole exploited once, but a failure of institutional skepticism, because every stage of the process assumed the previous stage had already asked the hard questions. Analysts documented how enrollment databases validated attendance logs, how attendance logs triggered automatic payments, and how payments, once issued, were never meaningfully reconciled against physical reality, allowing the network to grow year after year, increasing claims by nearly 68% annually without triggering alarms, a growth rate that would have been implausible in any legitimate care system. The investigation revealed not a failure of individual inspectors, but of oversight culture, where inspections were scheduled, predictable, and limited to surface indicators, and where forms validated each other until verification became ceremonial. Over this period, more than 800 fictitious children were cycled through rosters, while real families in surrounding neighborhoods experienced longer wait lists, reduced access, and an estimated 22% drop in available subsidized care slots, a measurable community impact that compounded quietly as resources were drained. Complicity did not require overt corruption because low-level officials relied on automated approvals. Banks processed wires that stayed just below reporting thresholds, and international transfers were fragmented into volumes small enough to appear routine, demonstrating how protection came not from power, but from normalcy. By the time the system collapsed, over 90 individuals faced charges, assets were frozen, and facilities shuttered, but investigators were careful not to describe the outcome as victory, because this was not justice delivered in full. It was correction applied late. The machine was stopped, but the scars remained in communities that had trusted licensed institutions, and in public programs now under suspicion by those they were meant to serve. Lawmakers called for reforms, audits were expanded, and new verification measures were proposed, yet internal reports cautioned that rules alone would not prevent recurrence if trust continued to replace inquiry. This network survived because it looked legitimate, because it wore the language of care and compliance, and because systems stopped asking whether paperwork reflected reality. The operation ended, the consequences did not, and the lesson investigators recorded was stark and nonpartisan. Safety does not come from titles, licenses, or forms. It comes from vigilance, because when systems are allowed to trust repetition over proof, exploitation becomes inevitable. And if you believe accountability and transparency matter, subscribe to ensure stories like this are examined rather than ignored.